So we're just starting this conversation a little bit, talking about a little bit the difference between this advisory board, an advisory board versus a governing board. So an advisory board that many of you have been serving on advises on the project. You don't generally have any legal responsibilities unless there's something that's put into place, but it's not uncommon for different projects to have advisory boards. Once you create a nonprofit, you have a governing board. And the governing board is set up to essentially govern the organization. And in your bylaws that are part of your 501c3 application, you define how you're going to govern yourselves. It is a separate, independent entity, and nonprofits belong in the public trust. So they're set up essentially to do good, some kind of good, and they're set up essentially to have some very clear expectations, roles, responsibilities, things that they do that benefits the public. But as part of your governing work, you do have legal accountability. So as you were saying, LaDawn, you had to sign that, they can come in and check records. All nonprofits belong in the public trust, meaning that no individual owns them. A group governs them, and if you ever close a nonprofit, all of those items that belong in that profit, whether it be money, whether it be computers, they all get given to another nonprofit. So along those lines, whenever you're talking about effective organizations and you're in a advisory capacity or a governing capacity, you want to be in a place you have really clear expectations, you have consistency and accountability. The biggest difference, though, the biggest purpose of a board is to ensure that you have legal roles and responsibilities and that nonprofit boards understand those. So is everybody able to see the computer screen? Are you able to see the PowerPoint that I have up too?
I'm actually just on audio. I'm not using my computer.
Okay.
This is Lynette. I'm sorry.
Lynette. Okay. So Lynette, I've got a little bit of a PowerPoint going on as well. So in the state of Wyoming, in your annotated codes, there are usually 2 or 3 codes around what your legal responsibilities are as board members. And those include the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. And the duty of care comes into play where it says you have to show that you are taking care, that you're reading the information and you're making the best decision for the organization. And so that requires you to read the financials and understand them. It requires you to understand what your role and responsibilities are as a nonprofit board member. And along those lines, you put into place bylaws and policies, and you have to be loyal to those, which means whatever you talk about internally within that nonprofit as part of that board process, you have to follow those. You have to be loyal to the policies put into place, the mission of the organization. You have to make sure that what you do is in the best interest of that organization. And that's especially true in our small towns where we hear a lot of information. You can't walk out of that board table and go and share that information if it's not appropriate. And that gets to the third, which is this notion of the obedience. You have to be obedient to the mission. You have to be obedient to the work, meaning that whatever the laws are of the nation regarding nonprofits or the bylaws, the policy you put in place yourself, you have to follow those. So those 3 duties are very different than what you would see on an advisory board that's strictly advisory. These are legal, and when there's an issue, and you have boards making decisions, and one of the things people come back and ask is, did they due diligence with care? Did they read the notes? Did they follow their own guidelines? Were they loyal? Did they avoid conflicts of interest? Were they obedient? Did they follow their own policies? So those are kind of the three big duties. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So it can dive into details like LaDon, where you say, okay, I'm getting this email that says they can look at my computer. I don't know what that is. I don't know if that's something with the Patriot Act or what. But you definitely have to file 990s every year. Any federal, state, nonprofit, or foundation funds that you take, they can come in and say, I want these files to be audited. And generally for a period of 5 to 7 years, you have to hold on to records and make sure that you keep those records available for audit. And it also means if you're hiring employees, you have to pay payroll taxes. You have to pay whatever the law says around payroll, whether it's FICA. And if you don't, board members can be personally held accountable for unpaid payroll taxes. So you have to take that hiring process and the payment of benefits very seriously. Equally so, I know this is not very common in Indian country, but it is in other places. You know, if something happens, say you have a liability issue with a child, you can be sued. And that's why many nonprofit boards are protected by state laws, or what they often call blue laws, if you're serving in a volunteer capacity, that it protects you from lawsuits. But it is highly recommended that you have officers and directors liability insurance. And so generally, once you get the 501c3, you go out and you hire that. And you develop a contract for that. And it's usually about $1,000 a year. Does that make sense? Or let me stop and see if there's questions at this point.
Okay, this is Lynette. What kind of insurance was that?
They often call it D&O insurance, or directors and officers liability insurance.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you can go on and line, and there's different insurance agencies that carry it and purchase it. You don't need it yet, but once you have your 501c3, you will want to make a determination probably to get it.
And you said $1,000.
Back up.
Sorry, go ahead, Lynette.
So, just specifically about liability, personally, as a board member, are we liable?
Yes, you're liable for a few things. You can be held accountable, and you are liable for any unpaid payroll taxes. So if somebody is not paying the payroll taxes, and the IRS figures this out, they can come and assess you. So as a board member, you want to make sure you're doing your due diligence, reading the financials, and finding out if the payroll taxes have been paid. Right. In your bylaws, I haven't seen your bylaws, but you probably have a statement that declares that board members are not, have immunity from different things. But that doesn't mean it necessarily holds up. For example, say you hire a pedophile to work with your group and you didn't know it, but nobody did a background check. You can be sued for that, and really no director's officer's liability insurance is going to help you around that. That director's and officer's liability insurance really covers the cost of hiring a lawyer in the event of a, but it doesn't take away your personal accountability. So there are things you're personally accountable for.
which kind of emphasizes the point of doing due diligence.
Exactly. And that gets to that point of taking meeting minutes, documenting that everybody reviewed the prior meeting minutes, that you understand them, that you go in with often what they call the prudent man rule around this duty of care, that you're just showing that you have carefully done your work as a governing board member. And this is the big difference between this kind of board and a advisory board. Advisory board, if something happens, they're going to sue the tribe. The tribe is the ultimate accountable party there. You're advisory. In the governing capacity, a nonprofit governing board, you are legally accountable. And that's why you make decisions as a group. In most states, you're required to have a minimum of 3 board members, and you do adequate documentation. So those are some of the kind of big differences between this advisory board and a nonprofit. All that being said, I can't emphasize how important a nonprofit structure is for allowing you to diversify funds and to really do the different kinds of work you want to do in ways that make sense. You can keep those bylaws fairly flexible. You can create the kind of governing structure you really want, one that really holds up traditional indigenous values and governing practices. I work with a number of Native boards that run on consensus. They don't have presidents, vice presidents. They often do chairs. They rotate them. They want to share leadership, and board members that stay on for years and years. So a little bit different than you would see with a non-Native board. And as you say, it comes down to that duty of care, that real doing your due diligence. So under those kind of required codes, there's what we often call, I think, about 4 buckets around things that you do as a nonprofit board. And a lot of these are the same as you would do with an advisory board. I mean, one of the biggest ones is around the idea of leadership, that you do strategic planning. Just like you're doing some planning work now, you learn everything you can, and you lay out a plan for the future. And this is probably one of the most important things that board members do, because when you hire staff, you're really asking them to implement the plan. But the board develops the plan and the scope of work and determines what that is. You're also setting a culture for the organization. How do you want to work with each other? What are traditional ways of working that make sense? How do you think about your group norms? All of that comes into play as part of the strategic planning process. And one of the other critical things you do in this leadership role is you set an example. You know the kinds of things you want your organization to be doing, and you live into those values. And then lastly, you promote the organization. Does that make sense? Any questions on on leadership before I switch to governance? So with governance, there's a number of key things that you want to pay attention to. You want to review the bylaws. And LaDawn, you can share those bylaws if you haven't with everybody so people can read them, see what's in them, understand the terms, understand the ways you've defined officer roles, ways that you've tried to provide immunity, whatever those things are. And in addition to the bylaws, you also put some policies in place, some policies around how you're going to work together. And I can certainly send you a draft policy manual. These, again, show the distinctions between the nonprofit governing board and that you have your own bylaws, your own policies, and you follow them, as opposed to the advisory capacity that you're in now, where you are advising on a project and you are following tribal law and tribal policy. You'll want to work on annual work plans. So especially as you go down the road, if you filed a 501c3, You'll want to make sure you understand what you want to get done annually and write that down. You're going to have a budget and be held accountable to that budget. And that budget will always be separate from the budget of the federal grant that's being run through the tribe. This budget will be just the budget for the nonprofit. And then generally in your bylaws, you might define a few standing committees. Do you know, LaDon, did you have that in your current set of bylaws?
Honestly, I can't remember. Maybe somebody has read it. It's fresher in their mind than mine. Recently, we just sent it out again. So, if anybody has read it recently,
so
I don't remember anything.
It's worth after this call sharing those bylaws and talking through them. See what standing committees you put into place. Because remember, anything in the bylaws you have to follow. And so it's worth looking to see what standing committees you list in there. And are those the right ones for you? So along those lines, you will also have this role of stewardship. And that's really reviewing on a quarterly basis the budget and expenses. You're going to want to look at your expense line items. You want to review your plans, your financials, and you're going to want to manage. And that's managing the board. You have to always make sure you're adding new board members, you're recruiting them, training them, evaluating them, that you're being held accountable to each other. When you get to the point that you hire staff, generally your board chair is the one handling all the communication with the executive director. That's really a shared leadership model. No individual board member can go in and give orders to the executive director. But you can, as a board, make a commitment to share information through the board chair to the executive. The executive director does work for the board, they work for the chair. And so it's, again, having very clear employment policies and following whatever the tribal or state laws are around those and following and doing due diligence. So you're a board when you sit at a table and you make decisions together. When you're away from that table, away from those meetings, you're a highly engaged volunteer. And so the expectation is with a nonprofit board, you help with fundraising, you help raise money, you work on operational plans, and that means kind of what are you going to do this month, next month, those daily and weekly and monthly plans. And a way to do that is just use a governance calendar where every month you set up a system and you say, okay, this month we want to accomplish these things. Next month we want to accomplish these things. We have a saying here, the board manages the board and the staff manages the staff. So under an advisory board, you're often reporting to a program chair. The advisory board is giving advice to paid staff. Is that how this grant is set up now? Is that correct?
Again, Tommy?
So often when you are running a federal grant and you have an advisory board, that advisory board is reporting to a paid staff member. They're advising a paid staff or a department how to implement something. Is that how you're set up now?
I would say so, yeah. Don't you think so? Asking the ladies.
This is Adrian. I'd say that it's been working like that, but then it's been only like clarified in that terminology since like recent board meeting. Because the tribe, as far as the tribal council members, I feel like, this is my own personal opinion, that they're always really, really busy, like almost too busy to, be maybe as engaged as like a governing board once it's a 501c3. So I know that they got updates from the paid staff, but I don't know. Like I think the paid staff was taking a lot of the advice of the board members, Lynette and Arlene and LaDawn and Pat when she was on it. So
Nice. So this is one of the biggest differences between a advisory board and a nonprofit governing board. The nonprofit governing board sets the rules, sets the policies, and the staff report to them, and they follow them. So the board manages that process, and then usually with the executive director, if you have one or not, they decide how they're going to work, and that information gets communicated down. So unlike an advisory board where you are giving advice and they are taking that or not taking that, and it's by choice, in a nonprofit, like I'm an executive director, I report to the board. I am expected both to coach the board, give them good advice and help them, and if they put a mandate in place or say this is going to be a new policy, I implement that with a staff. And often there's what they call a shared leadership role. Often you hire an executive director that probably has as much, if not more, policy knowledge than the board chair. So the executive director is kind of constantly coaching the board chair into things that need to be done. But really, at the end of the day, I don't supersede the board chair. I report to this person and I follow their directives, and I am hired and fired by them. So that managing role of the board is really important in that nonprofit structure. Can you see those two differences there? So you have a group of people, and this is what LaDawn, whoever you've named in that 501c3 application, it's really important that they're bought in, they've signed on, that they're active, because it is their legal responsibility to orient, train, engage, get the organization set up. They evaluate the work they're doing together. They improve the process. They retain board members. And then you go through that process all over again of recruiting more board members, analyzing the work, training up to the next phase of work, raising the money. You have the fundraising responsibility. And then going through that process again of evaluating the work that got done. So it's constantly a cycle, and you go through it all the time. So board members should have job descriptions, and I'm so glad to send you some examples of it. And they're really, as we say, living documents. They're going to change, but it's a process of saying board service is a job. There's certain things that board chairs do, vice chairs do, secretaries, treasurers do, and that you're constantly training for those positions. Would it be helpful to you, LaDawn, if I sent you some examples of some board positions? You may find you have that already in your bylaws.
This is Adrian. I looked at the bylaws we have since that last question came up about the standing committees, and it doesn't look like we have standing committees, and I don't believe we have job descriptions. So I think that it would help to just see an example of how organizations do that.
Okay. I'm glad to send you some examples of that. And again, the nice thing is you don't have to take any examples and just adopt them. You can make them your own. Make it work for you and your nonprofit, if that's the route you decide to go. So in a nonprofit board, the board is the organization's most critical function. Supported, not led by the executive director, and the entire board decides who new prospective leaders will be. And just like everything else, you want to identify board candidates that really have the right personality for this work, good reputations, they have the time to do it, and community connections. Unlike an advisory board where people really don't have any legal accountability, so if you have a board member that doesn't show up on a regular basis, you don't worry about it too much. On a nonprofit board, you want to make sure that people are showing up and they are taking responsibility and they're making good decisions. You don't want people sitting on a board where they're not regularly attending the board meetings. So let me stop there while we're talking about board members and board candidates. Just see if there's any questions, or is this going the right direction? Is there other information you'd like to make sure that I cover as part of this? LaDawn, am I covering the kind of information that would be useful for you all at this point?
Yeah, for me, how does everybody else feel? One thing that I'm, concerned about is, okay, so like on the IRS form, you step down, but your name is still there. How does that work?
So you refile every year. You file a new 990, and you file with the state every year. And so those names will be updated on those forms every single year. So it's kind of an annual commitment. So when you filed your state form, LaDawn, you listed 3 names, and you at least have one that's not active now, correct?
Right.
So when you go to refile, which you have to do that annually, you have to file a new, it's often called a business entity form. You'll put the names of those active board members on it when you go to refile again next year. And once you get the 501c3, you will file an annual 990. It's another form for the IRS, and you will update those board members that are currently serving every single year.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So you're constantly updating those. And those are the 2 big forms that you file. The state form is generally 1 page. You do it in 5 minutes. You just want to know the new board members. The federal form is a very quick, easy, what they call an e-postcard to start, but as you dive in and do more work on it, you wind up eventually getting a form that's 20 pages long. It might take you a few weeks to pull the financial information. And if you want to see a completed 990, just go to guidestar.org and type in any organization, any nonprofit. You can type in Hopa Mountain, and you can read our 990. By law, they are public. And on guidestar.org, you can read about any nonprofit in the country. All of that information, of course, belongs in the public trust, and it is all public information. So you can read who our board members are. You can read about what all our financial information was in the last year. So this gets to the notion of transparency. These organizations are very transparent by their nature. Now, we certainly keep confidential information confidential. We work with sensitive clients. We don't reveal who we're individually working with. We keep lists, especially with children. There's a lot of private information there. But your financial information is public. And the kind of work you do is public. It's just you don't have to identify individuals.
Bonnie, is it mandatory to report to GuideStar?
GuideStar. You don't even have to report to GuideStar. GuideStar is done for you. When you turn in your information to the IRS turns it all over to GuideStar. So they put it all. Yeah. You don't even have to do it. It goes in automatically. The nice thing about GuideStar, though, is you can go in and add information, and you get points. You get different levels of stars, quality assurances for being considered a very transparent organization. And you can get on and look at Hopa Mountain. We are working to meet the most transparent level. And you'll see we got some kudos up there for that. And we get special access to things because we give out more information than generally required. So you'll make choices about that. Your board will make choices about that. So that's why when you start thinking about who your board members are and recruiting who they are, you want to make sure they really understand that role of a 501c3, a nonprofit, how it differs from your advisory board, how that nonprofit is not going to have a say in any legal way in this federal grant. It's not going to have a say in how that work gets done. It's its own entity. You can certainly raise money. You can certainly take on new projects. You can certainly manage federal grants. You'll have your own EIN number, your own SAM management. You'll have your own DUNS number. These are two separate legal entities.
Bonnie, this is Adrian. I have another question about that. Like, have you seen examples of how tribal or things that started within a tribal grant formed a 501c3 with the same mission and then work together productively after that, where the tribal grant's still going and, you know, the board of directors is the tribal council, and then there's this 501c3 with similar or, you know, a mission based on that original mission within the tribal grant, and that they actually work back and forth together?
I have never seen that. I'll tell you what I have seen on many occasions, where a big tribal grant is ending and a group will form a 501c3 to keep the work going, because they will generally be in a situation where they know the tribe can't continue to do the work without grants. I've most often seen that done with youth programs, where the tribe will get a big SAMHSA grant to do a lot of health work. They'll do it for 4 or 5 years. They'll have a lot of success with it. And then all of a sudden the grant is coming to a close. There's no way to renew it. They know the tribe won't be able to continue doing that work without support. So they will go start a 501c3 and start diversifying funding streams. But generally that federal program closes and the 501c3 takes over. And there's kind of a natural attrition because the staff leave when the federal grant closes with a tribe. That's a more typical pattern. That is not to say what you're doing can't work and couldn't be a new model. I think, especially in the day and age we live, I think we've got to be open to lots of different ways of working. Now, I certainly worked for an organization for years that had both a government piece and a 501c3 piece.
I guess.
Let's see, I'm getting some really cool, interesting music. Are you guys hearing that?
Who got the elevator?
Yeah, somebody's in the elevator. If you could mute that, that'd be great. So I worked for a decade in my 20s for the Museum of the Rockies, and it was a 501c3, and it had a government piece. And it was a situation where years ago, it had started with a university, and the university couldn't raise all the money it needed, so they created a nonprofit. I don't know where that's coming from.
It's call-in user 3. I don't know who that is, if it's Lynette or... I'm assuming maybe not Arlene because she's at work, huh, Arlene?
I'm at work. That's not me.
You're not jamming out?
No, I'm not jamming out.
That's funny. Anyway.
It's fun. It can work, Adrian. I saw it, and it gets a little complex. And when you actually are reporting to two different boards, and you have two different streams of money, but the museum's now 50 years old, and it's been operating that way for a long time. So I've seen that model, and you just develop policies that work. And over the years there, they certainly had a switch where at one time it was 90% government and 10% private, and it's now 90% private and 10% public. And it just has to do with where federal funds are coming from or not coming from.
Okay, well, so just as a follow-up question, where you've often seen, a grant coming to an end and a group going and applying for the 501c3, what is usually the timeline on that? How far in advance do they plan that?
Typically a couple years, because right now the IRS is very backlogged. From the time you put your 501c3 in till the time you get it is typically 18 months.
Okay.
Can be faster, but right now I'm not seeing it. I'm working with a number of groups, and it's just slow right now.
Okay.
How many months? How many months again?
18, a year and a half. They were backlogged before the sequester last year, and it just made it more backlogged. That's not to say it's not a universal. Somebody can get it as fast as 6 months, but I'm not seeing it right now. Every group I'm working with is upwards of a year.
Okay. Yeah, because I know with this OVW grant, next year will be the third year, and it goes for 3 years. And then I know Sunny let us know that there is a possibility to apply for it for the next 3 years after that. But I think we were kind of looking into all of this now just in case. It'd be great if it does continue for another 3 years after that. But in case it, we need the 501c3 to continue the work, it'd be good to have it. So maybe it could lead to a new model where if it continues for another 3 years, we have the tribal organization with that grant and working with, Women Restored 501c3 with different funding streams just to augment the work.
Absolutely. I think it could work. I haven't seen that model in Indian country, but it makes sense to me because I lived that model for a decade. And it's like everything else, you got to be clear and realize who the reporting lines are. You can't cross those. And the thing about a 501c3, remember it's a business with a tax exemption. You have to follow all the same rules, and you can also close a 501c3. And people do all the time, and they transfer the assets. So that happens. And so it's not a problem to start one. You can change the board members. You can change the bylaws. I've worked with organizations that have changed their name. So all of this can be very fluid, and you grow into it over time. But I want to say, too, it's very much like a business in that the first 3 years, it can be very difficult to raise money because you don't have a track record. And so one of the things that you may want to ask yourself, you may want to ask the tribe, when you have the opportunity to reapply, does it make sense at all for the 501c3 to apply to do the next phase of work? It's just a question. But you might want to think creatively about how some of those relationships might get developed.
Okay, Bonnie, I have one other question before I forget. So if, right now, Lynette and Arlene, LaDawn and Sunny are advisory board members for the tribal grant. If we get the 501c3 status, can they still be the advisory board members for that grant and be the governing board members for the 501c3, or do they have to choose one or the other?
That's a really good question, and I can't answer that but to say I think you want to look and see where your conflicts of interest lie. If you're doing very similar work and you're being very transparent, you could have similar boards with the understanding that when you're sitting in that nonprofit board, you're going to make decisions that might, from time to time, put you in conflict with that federal grant. Mm-hmm. What happens when you get to a funding source that both of you could apply for? Or is there going to be pressures around that? I don't know. These are questions you have to ask yourselves. But as board members, remember, it gets to that question around duty of loyalty and duty of care. You can't go out and share that information in the advisory group. So you're in a little bit of a conflict of interest position.
Mm-hmm. That's a good answer.
Yeah. That was a no answer. It's not so clear. It's a very complex question, and it's something you got to talk through and think through. And I think it gets back to your norms and values, how you all want to work. With all these projects, if you could break down the competition, break down the competitiveness, the sense of scarcity, there's no reason why this model shouldn't work. I think it's one of those things of getting to that place of openness and trust and making sure that's there so you can proceed. So again, it gets to this whole notion, as Christian, you think about board orientation, really clear expectations. Nonprofit work should be fun. It's got to be led by your board. You have to make sure you sign really relevant forms. And you want to mentor each other. And as you bring on new board members, you want to have old board members mentor them. There's lots of places, too, to get nonprofit board training. I mean, you're utilizing us today, but know that there's other groups, Blue Avocado, Board Source. There's a group in Montana called the Montana Nonprofit Association. You can find good information on their website. Wyoming Community Foundation also has good information about boards. And so I want to encourage you, read everything you can. And we're so glad to share lots of information. And one of the things you'll want to do just what you're doing now, find time to do ongoing education. And we often recommend, take 15 minutes at each board meeting just to kind of train yourselves and provide more education to each other. And then you want to retain good board members. You want to thank them. You want to talk about the organization's progress on a regular basis. You want to recognize board members. You want to see how you can really support that good sense of spirit and camaraderie. And again, that board development process just keeps going. Because as you recruit new board members, you want to orient them, training them, engaging them, getting involved with project councils. You can also bring on a group that just serves in advisory capacity, but they are different from your legal governing board. And then you might have a project where it's a short-term project. You take it on for a short period of time. And in that case, you might put a task force in place. And so you'd have a task force. The nonprofit board is also legally responsible for the money. So you want to make sure you have a budget and you're following it with a strategic plan and a fundraising plan. That you understand, this issue around checks and balances. So generally you want to have at least 2 people involved in every check process. It's not 2 signatories, but meaning that you have a board treasurer and somebody else signing the check. So that not all the power lies with one person. You want some kind of check and balances, and you want some kind of accountability. How are you being accountable to a grant or accountable to a project? How do you go back and check who on the board does that? Do you all remember Enron?
Yeah.
Yeah. So after Enron, the Congress passed a law called Sarbanes-Oxley. And it says you have to have an opportunity to have a whistleblower protection policy. You have to have that as one of your policies now. so that if somebody sees something going wrong in the board or the staff, that they can blow a whistle and not lose their job. It also means you have to have a document destruction policy. Generally, you want to hold on to federal documents. I think the legal requirements that you hold on to some for 3 and some for 5. But generally, most groups hold on to documents for somewhere between 3 and 7 years. But you have to have a policy. You can't destroy the documents. You have to have a policy around how they get destroyed and when they get destroyed. You also you never want to give out loans as a nonprofit. It's very much looked down upon, just like having debit cards. You want to make sure that you have a system, a clear system for how you do money drawdowns and expend money in nonprofits. And remember this idea of the prudent man rule. As board of directors, you are coming to the table using your best judgment. At no time you should be coerced into a vote. Transparency comes into play. You have a lot of documents that are public documents. Federal Form 990 being one of them. And you have to make sure you disclose any conflicts of interest. If you wind up handling more than $500,000 of federal funds in a year, you do have to do an audit, what they call an A130 audit. So there's things you want to know as a nonprofit you have to do every single year, and these are different than your advisory board. You have to file a 990, you have to do an audit if you're over that $500,000 mark, and you have to file an annual state report. And then this whole notion of checks and balances, segregation of duties. No board member should have the checkbook be balancing the checks, writing the checks, and managing grants. You want to have at least 2 people in that system. Again, it's just to ensure that you're not creating liabilities for one person. Your policy should talk about what those checks and balances are. And so ideally you have a segregation of duties where you have a board, you have a finance committee within that board. If you have staff, you have an executive director, a finance manager, bookkeeper, CPA auditor. They're all playing roles in the management of money. Everybody looking at it, not just one person. You're going to want policies too around internal controls. How do you handle cash? How do you reimburse board for expenses? What amounts? How do you invest money? All of these become policies that you develop over time. And you have systems. So as an independent 501c3, you are working with QuickBooks, you have a backup to QuickBooks, and or you might have a payroll service. And now all the time you have some kind of oversight, accountability. That accountability comes in the form of financial statements, fund accounting, functional accounting. So you understand which funds are restricted and which ones are temporarily restricted. So restricted funds might come in the form of endowments or federal grants. Temporary restricted are where you have some flexibility in how those funds get spent. And then somebody might give you just a personal gift, and those become unrestricted. You can spend those any way you want. And then you're going to talk about different kinds of programs and who's going to administer programs and who's going to do fundraising. So all of this comes into play when you're doing financial reports, quarterly reports, programmatic reports. And the important thing here is you want to do them on a quarterly basis. So I just want to briefly talk about fundraising, and then I'd like to open up for questions. But to say one of the biggest differences with a nonprofit board versus a advisory board is you're responsible for fundraising. You want to get the community behind your mission. You want to work on grants and other opportunities to earn money. You want to figure out how you're going to sustain the organization. And that often comes from getting the word out. Having a core message, you deliver very consistently, and helping people understand the importance of giving. And the reason you want to focus on helping individuals understand is the majority of money comes from individual gifts. Overwhelmingly, 82% of individuals are giving to charity, and they are giving every single year, and it's the largest pool of funds. And that's why you invest in websites and getting the word out on Facebook and helping people understand the value of your work. And that work is all about fundraising. Who do you know? How can they get them excited? And then you also want to think about the board's role in what happens if there's not sufficient resources. Who is going to cut the budget? How are you going to cut the budget? How are you going to volunteer time to raise more money? So you want to look at your fundraising and always say, is this a really realistic plan? Will resources be available? How are we going to get this work done? Most nonprofits need some kind of help with fundraising, and you'll have to decide what that help looks like for you. Sometimes it's hiring a grant writer, sometimes it's hiring a development officer or an admin person that needs some kind of help. So at the end of the day, there's a lot to do, but you want to inspire your board. You want to keep them going, engaged, and give them a real piece of this work to do. And everybody should be rowing together, working together on nonprofit board. And you can just ask people how they want to get engaged and let them know the expectation is there to be engaged. So let me stop there, and I'd love to just address any additional questions you have and see what I can do to provide any additional information that would be useful to you this time. Well, Dawn, any questions on your end? Or Lynette?
Not any that I can think of. I don't have any. I just thank you for all the information.
Oh, I'm so glad. And there's more, but I think for today.
Overload.
Yes, it's a lot.
I agree. I'm in overload. Overload. I'm in overload.
Okay, I know, there's just a lot. We can stop here today, but know when you're ready to do more, we can do more. And just know that you just learn this. You just learn it step by step, piece by piece. And I just want to encourage you, try the nonprofit. You do have legal roles and responsibilities, but you can do this. You're smart women. You're willing to do due diligence. You know what this looks like. You've had prior board experience. Teach each other and just try it out. If it doesn't work, you can always close the 501c3. But you may find, especially with the shifting winds of federal grants these days, having the 501c3 and being able to raise additional money beyond what the tribe would be able to raise would be very helpful for continuation of this work. And I've seen that happen many, many occasions. And there's no reason not to file, and if you decide at the end of the day it's not the right thing, close it.
Yeah, we just had an event last week, and the woman presenting doesn't take any federal money. That's all she gets is foundation and private money, and doing incredible stuff.
Do you remember who it was?
Yeah, her name is Becca Stevens. She runs Thistle Farms.
Oh, nice. Yes, there are.
Do you know of it?
No, I don't, but I have worked very closely with Seventh Generation Fund, and they are a nonprofit, been around for 30 years, native-led, and they're absolutely committed to taking no federal funds. And they have done it exceedingly well. So this comes into that values. What do you want to be? How do you want to be? You can set yourself up if that's where you say your values lie. So I just want to encourage you. It buys you enormous amounts of freedom to do things the way you want it to be done and do it well. It sounds wonderful. Any other closing thoughts today? Or Questions?
This is Adrian. I was wondering, for the board members, and myself really, like, are you willing to share your PowerPoint slides? Just so we could, like, go back and jog our memory through the conversation.
I certainly can. I can share these. I wasn't able to record it, but I'm glad to share these PowerPoint slides.
Okay, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll email it to
And Bonnie, if you could send all of those examples that you spoke about, which I meant to mark them in my notes, but didn't. I don't know, there were like 2 or 3 things that you said that you could send examples of.
Yeah, we talked about policies. We talked about board job descriptions as examples.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if you'd have examples of the conflict of interest agreement or confidentiality statement. I mean, I know we would go through and make it specific to Women Restored, but those might be helpful too.
Great, I'm glad to send those to you. And so you ladies know every April we offer a 3-day training program for Native-led nonprofits. It's in Bozeman. If you get accepted, we cover all the costs. And so
we applied for it this year, but didn't get accepted.
Yeah, so I encourage you, apply early next year, apply in January, because we get more groups that want to come than we can accept. And we definitely do it on a first come, first served basis. So get your application in early. That'll help you a lot.
Okay.
If that's a route you want to go.
That's good news. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And by next January, your readiness scale will be way up too. You'll potentially have an application that's been pending for 6 months, and you'll be saying to yourself, wow, we will get the 501c3 in 2015. We have a grant closing. We've got to be ready to step and see what we can do to be helpful. And definitely reach out to the Wyoming Community Foundation. There's a lot of other resources that can help you. And I know, too, there's some small grants that you can apply for through them and others that might be a good way to start just working on your board development or your strategic planning as you're waiting for that 501c3 application. Okay.
That's a good suggestion. So they have like small grants to develop that?
Yeah,
for the Community Foundation?
Absolutely. You can apply for small grants through 7th Generation Funds. There's others where until you have that piece of paper in your hand, it's often difficult to raise a lot of money, but you can generally apply for some small amounts of money to do some planning while you're waiting for that 501c3 final determination letter. So it might be something you want to look at. I know in the past, I've done a little work with the Wyoming Community Foundation. They've had some resources available. You'll have access to the Abelard Foundation there in Wyoming. If you Google Wyoming Foundations online, you'll see lots of lists of the largest foundations that fund in Wyoming. Starting to collect some of that information would be very helpful to you too. And seeing who is out there that is interested in funding your kind of work and starting to cultivate relationships with them. All of that is part of this pre-planning phase as you're waiting for that final determination. Well, I'll stop here. It's been such a privilege to work with all of you ladies today. I'll send you this information. And if there's any additional follow-up, please don't hesitate to give me a call. You're welcome to call me anytime. And glad to continue this conversation when you're ready. We'll do the next phase of the PowerPoint. There's more, and this is all part of just taking it step by step.
Thank you, Bonnie.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You ladies have a good day. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye-bye.